As millions of Americans are preparing to file their income taxes ahead of Monday's deadline, we look today at how corporations and the wealthy are utilizing offshore banks and tax havens to avoid paying taxes and other governmental regulations. Earlier this year, Democratic Senator Carl Levin introduced two bills to crack down on tax havens. Levin estimates that nearly $100 billion is lost each year by not closing tax loopholes. Besides Levin's bill, there has been little discussion in Washington on the issue, despite the intense debate over the budget. During President Obama's budget speech on Wednesday, he uttered the words tax and taxes nearly 40 times. Never once did he mention tax havens.
Our first guest today is the British journalist Nicholas Shaxson, author of the new book Treasure Islands, Uncovering the Damage of Offshore Banking and Tax Havens. In the book, Shaxson writes, quote, "The offshore system is the secret underpinning for the political and financial power of Wall Street today. It's the fortified refuge of big finance." Nicholas Shaxson joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what you're calling treasure islands. Nicholas Shaxson. We'll go to a music break and we'll come back to see if we can get the audio of Nicholas Shaxson. Looks like we got it right now. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Nicholas.
Thanks.
It's good to have you with us. Okay, explain what these treasure islands are.
Well, my book's about tax havens, and one of the big themes of my book is that tax havens are much, much bigger and much more important than almost anybody realizes. Most people think of tax havens as just a bunch of shady places, perhaps out in the Caribbean, Switzerland, a couple of other places, where a few celebrity tax dodgers maybe and some mafiosi and some criminals go and put their money. And they see it as a kind of exotic sideshow to the global economy. One of the central messages of my book, and I explore the history of this in quite a lot of detail, is that tax havens have grown so fast in the era of globalization since kind of the 1970s that they have now become they are now right at the heart of the global economy, and they're absolutely huge. I mean, there are anywhere between 10 and 20 trillion US dollars sitting offshore at the moment. Half of world trade is processed in one way or another through tax havens. It's all around us, and it's absolutely huge. Part of that, that message is that the biggest tax havens in the world are not so much these little islands, but big, rich countries. The United Kingdom, my country, is one of the world's most important tax havens. And right now in Washington, D.C., I'm sitting in one of the world's biggest tax havens as well, the United States. So this is something we need to really reappraise the whole geography of the system and understand how important it is. And when we're hearing figures of $100+ billion lost to U.S. taxpayers, I would argue that is just one aspect of the problem. The problem is much, much bigger. There are many, many other aspects to consider here.
But when you say that the United Kingdom itself is a tax haven, what do you mean, and how did that develop?
Well, there are two aspects to this, really. One is the UK, the City of London, which is the financial district of the United Kingdom, is itself a tax haven. And I need to explain a little bit what I mean by tax haven. There's no general agreement worldwide as to what a tax haven is. A lot of people focus on the tax element, but it's much more than that. Tax havens do offer zero or low taxes to people elsewhere, but they also offer secrecy. They offer escape routes from financial regulation. They offer escape routes from criminal laws. The key theme here is escape. If you don't want to if you are constrained by democratic rules and curbs at home, you take your money offshore, you take it elsewhere to a place where they'll let you do what you're not allowed to do at home. And looking at the history of this, Wall Street, after the Second World War, after the Bretton Woods Agreement, 1946, there was a cooperative international order set up where capital was tightly controlled around the world. Wall Street was very firmly put in its place, and you know, there were very high taxes on the wealthy. And for about a quarter of a century, this system more or less worked out, and capital was quite tightly constrained. It was also an era of very high, broad-based economic growth, not just in the United States, but around the world. What happened during that period, though, was that the banks, Wall Street in particular, obviously didn't like these curbs, didn't like the Glass-Steagall Act that was separating commercial from investment banking, didn't like interest rate caps, didn't like these controls. And essentially they went off to London. And in London, the Bank of England and the City of London said, basically, you bring your money here and you can do what you like. We're not going to worry about Glass-Steagall. We're not going to worry about interest rate caps. And so what happened is Wall Street piled into London from about the 60s onwards. And that really marked the unraveling of parts of the unraveling of the Bretton Woods arrangements. And Wall Street was able to grow incredibly fast offshore, much, much faster than it had been before. And this ability to grow offshore, first in London and then in a wider network of tax havens around the world, this has been one of the great reasons why it has been able to grow so fast. And now we have too big to fail banks. And this offshore system, the ability of banks in the United States to go elsewhere, to do things that allow them to grow faster and take more risks away from the democratic curbs, it's one of the reasons why they've grown so powerful and why we have got such a difficult situation today with Wall Street having such power over the politicians in this country and my country and others.
You talk in your book also about Britain recreating a new empire, and you mentioned all of the Caribbean islands that most Americans have heard about as vacation spots, but really don't pay much attention to. Anguilla, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, Turks and Caicos. What role do they play in this exploding situation with tax havens?
It's a very curious story. I and my co-researchers went into the archives in the United Kingdom and looked at what they were saying at the time. What we had was we have a series of partly British territories spread around the world, notably the British overseas territories, which include the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, the Turks and Caicos, Gibraltar, Anguilla, and the so-called Crown dependencies, which are closer to the UK. That's Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man. And all of these centres were allowed, they're partly controlled by Britain. They do have independent politics as well. It's a sort of half-in, half-out kind of offshore system. But Britain has this kind of network around the world. But what this network does is that these places serve as conduits. They serve as channels for business to be passed to the City of London. So there's this kind of network of havens around the world capturing business. So in the Caribbean, a lot of business captured from the United States, Latin America. And this is licit and illicit business. It's a mixture of the two. And the Crown dependencies, Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man, capturing business, focusing more on Europe, perhaps, and Africa and the Middle East. And all this, so they're serving as feeders for the City of London. And I was talking about how the offshore system has been used by Wall Street to become so big and powerful. Well, the UK has its own special version of that, and that's this network which has really, as well as the UK itself being a tax haven, this network feeding business into the City of London is an absolutely colossal reason why the City of London is now, by some measure, the world's biggest financial centre. So it's something that has, it is at the period of decolonisation. This is when this system really started getting together and started working. And one can make an argument that this is a new kind of financial empire, that Britain, a kind of hidden empire that nobody really has paid much attention to in now. But it is of absolutely tremendous importance. And we in the United Kingdom are just as, we have the banks holding our politicians by the throat, I think, just as much as you do here in the United States.
I wanted to go to U.S. presidential politics. One of the leading Republican presidential contenders, Mitt Romney, has a history of profiting from offshore tax havens. In 2008, the Los Angeles Times exposed how Romney, as head of Bain Capital, utilized shell companies and 2 offshore tax havens in Bermuda and the Cayman Islands to help eligible investors avoid paying U.S. taxes. The tax-friendly jurisdictions helped attract billions of investment dollars to Bain Capital. Los Angeles Times reporter Bob Drogan spoke to us about this in 2008.
A sidelight of that was Bain Capital, which is today has assets of about $60 billion. That's the number that they officially say. And about a third of that comes from these offshore operations that Romney set up when he was still there. In particular, companies that are set up, really, they're just mail drops. They're mailboxes. They don't have any staff. They don't have any operations. The one on Grand Cayman Island is a post office box 60D, I think, on Grand Cayman Island, and the ones in Bermuda are also at a lawyer's office, but they've got them in other places as well, and they bring in somewhere above $25 billion a year. And again, these are companies, these are operations set up through various systems. They're blocker corporations. They are investment, or rather, equity groups that are set up to attract, for the large part, foreign capital. And the reason these are set up overseas is so that foreign investors in these private companies can avoid paying U.S. taxes. Mitt Romney and his colleagues don't get that advantage. So it's not like they're avoiding taxes through this. It's simply what happens is they're helping other people avoid paying U.S. taxes, and as a result, they make enormous profits.
That's Los Angeles Times reporter Bob Drogan speaking to us in 2008. Nicholas Shaxson, your response.
Yeah, this is, I mean, there are two things I'd respond to this. First of all, there is a lot of this business is legal. There are two terms: tax avoidance and tax evasion. Avoidance is by definition not doing anything illegal, but also by definition getting around the spirit of the law. This is not what legislators intended when they set up the legislation. Tax evasion, on the other hand, is by definition criminal. It is you're breaking the law. But in between these two poles of evasion and avoidance is a huge grey area, and often you don't find out which side of the law a company is until there's been, a challenge by the IRS or a court case or something like that. Former British Chancellor Dennis Healey once said the difference between avoidance and evasion is the thickness of a prison wall. But also, the example of Mitt Romney, I imagine what he was doing was on the avoidance side, not on the evasion side, is this issue of intermediaries, people who help others. And we're talking here particularly about accountancy firms, law firms, and banks, and also company formation agents. These intermediaries have, for such a long time, seen a very simple calculus. They get, I saw a statistic yesterday that for the big four accountancy firms, on certain kinds of business, the average profit for a client was something like $360. The maximum fine for infringement for assisting a client to do things that have gone wrong is $10,000. So it's a very simple calculation. If you get caught, well, you pay a bit of money, but it'll only be a fraction of your profits. And as a result of these kinds of incentives, you've had the complete corruption of the culture of these industries, saying we're just going to, help these people. We don't care if they're breaking the law or avoiding tax or whatever. We'll just help them do what they want to do. And it's this corruption of the culture is one of the biggest problems of the whole issue.
Nicholas Shaxson, I want to ask you about the portion of your book that deals with the impact of these tax havens on the poor countries of the world. You say at one point in the book, nearly every effort to generate large flows of capital to developing countries since the 1980s has ended in crisis because the money has escaped offshore. Towering inequalities in Europe and the United States, not to mention in undeveloped countries, cannot be understood properly without exploring the role of secrecy jurisdictions. The systematic looting of the former Soviet Union and the merging of the nuclear-armed country's intelligence apparatus with organized crime is substantially a story that unfolds in London and its offshore satellites. You also talk about Saddam Hussein's billions and the power of North Korea's Kim Jong-il. Could you explain?
Yeah, offshore, if you look at these crises, offshore is always a part of the story. It's never the whole story. You can always point to other factors in, the corruption of a country or economic crisis, but offshore is always a huge part of the story. And you've had in these debt crises, you have had huge lending to developing countries, and the rulers in these countries and the ruling elites are able to appropriate this money, the money that comes in from borrowing, and they take it offshore, and you have countries left saddled with debts.